those who haven't seen it, hopefully you get the gist of what we're talking about. And it's really, we're going to go through the three main areas that we're going to talk about this afternoon: process heat, transportation and electricity. And we're just going to present some of the work that we've done at the Energy Group at the University of Waikato. So this is our group. We're a mixture of, we're in the engineering school, we're a mixture of mechanical and chemical engineers. We do a whole lot of work with heavy industry around energy efficiency. We also have a joint program with Scion around industrial symbiosis and bioenergy as well. And we also do a lot of industrial training around, pump and fan systems, steam systems and things like that. So at sort of the plant level is where we tend to operate. Okay, so what I guess we've talked about our commitments around the Paris Accord, and if my laser pointer here works. This here is taken from the Royal Society report, and it basically shows our gross emissions over a number of years to about 2013. That's the last official reporting year for our carbon inventory, and then our net emissions, which is basically that's what we emit, and this is including, the net emissions are including forestry sinks and other things like that. Now, interestingly enough, the 30% reduction by 2030, the goal is to get down to, I think it's 59 megatons of carbon. That's 30% of our gross emissions. Okay, but what actually needs to get there is our net emissions need to get to that 59, not our gross emissions. Okay, and so we need to do something like that. The projections, because this includes forestry, and when you plant a forest, you know that's sort of locked in for 30 years or so. Due to a number of factors, our net emissions or our forestry sinks are predicted to decline, and so our net and our gross emissions are predicted to converge over that commitment period to 2030. And so there will be some of that reduction, I guess, from our gross to meet our target that will come from forestry and other sinks, but there is a gap, and depending on which numbers you look at, it could be around 19 to 20 megatons of carbon. So when we're talking about reduction, that's sort of the numbers that we're talking about. Percentages sometimes are hard to get down to the nitty-gritty of what it means, but we're looking really, according to these projections, around for 20 megatons of carbon reduction. Okay, and I guess if we look at where that is currently emitted, okay, we've got, this is from the carbon balance. Obviously agriculture make up, a large percentage of our economy, and in our webinar we touched on that briefly. We're not going to talk about that today, but certainly energy, transportation, and some of these other ones. Down the end, this is bioenergy. Hopefully there's some foresters in the room. That if we go look from 2005 to 2013, there's been a decrease due to a number of factors in forestry. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully that's just a reminder for many of you. And I'll pass it to Tim.
Alright, so first of all, this is the breakdown of our energy across New Zealand, and we've sort of labelled three general sectors: transport, process heat and electricity. Perhaps what might surprise you a little bit is electricity is only 25% approximately of the total PJs that we use in New Zealand. But of course the PJs in electricity are of much higher quality than perhaps heat or even transport. So I guess what's a couple of very important points here. You can see over in transport, personal use vehicles, they command about 20% of our energy demand across New Zealand. In process heat, we have about 20% of our energy demand for indirect industrial process heat. This is burning coal, natural gas, wood, black liquor in the pulp industry, that sort of stuff. But we also have a fair amount of direct use, which may be in the oil refinery, burning the feedstock in order to refine to petrol, or it may be over in the steel mill where you're burning coal in order to heat up the steel and to refine the steel. And of course coal is also used as a feedstock for the steel. Then we've also put Tiwai Point. It's a bit of an anomaly because it sits between electricity, it uses electricity, but a lot of it is for process heat in the sense that it's melting aluminium. So this gives you a bit of an overview of where we use our energy. So what we're going to do now is actually walk through the three main sectors, transport, process heat, and electricity in that order to break it down into individual, where is that energy actually being used, and to give you a bit of an understanding. And so this afternoon, as we start to develop ideas and concepts to make a dent on the 19 megatons that we need for emissions reduction, we actually target the areas that have the largest energy use and therefore have the largest opportunity for emissions reduction. Alright, so one of the things to always remember is we have to grow between now and 2030, and there's going to be a population increase. It's projected by the ministry. Those data are just taken from Statistics New Zealand, which is a ministry projection. And so as a result of that, we're also going to have an increase in transport demand, and therefore the increase in the number of PJs that we use for transport. And so if we just maintain business as usual, that's the sort of lines we're going to follow. Don't tell me if it may not be precise, but close enough. And so likewise, there's going to be an emissions increase with that increase in demand of transport. So what we've done is we've constructed these interesting, what I'd call a stacked curve. On the y-axis we plot the emissions, and then on the x-axis we have some useful unit. And in the case of transport, our desire is actually to transport a person from A to B that has some weight and some distance, so we just times those two together, and so that produces what we call a useful transport output. And there's sort of two general categories. There's freight and then there's passenger. We don't want to be in cattle crate, we don't want to be squashed together like we're freight, and so we want to have a little bit more space, and so we're a lot less efficient in our transport of humans, I guess you could say as well. So what stands out in this graph in particular is if you look at the very almost vertical red line up there, the LPV, light passenger vehicles, that's what we're using in light passenger vehicles. A lot of emissions just associated with that one use. Then air transport, this is trying to fly all around the world, us Kiwis, trying to get wings. And there's another fair chunk of emissions just used in air transport. So the solutions that we come up with for light passenger vehicles aren't necessarily the same as what we'll come up with air transport. It's a lot harder to have enough batteries to fly from here to Australia, at least at the moment. So it has to be very much a specific solution for an individual application. Also, what's very interesting is marine is extremely efficient, but it still uses energy. So just because it doesn't have a lot of emissions doesn't mean you can't target that sector. Just the opportunity or the total reduction is going to be a lot less than if you target light passenger vehicle. And it was pleasing to hear that the minister is sort of trying to lead the charge in the light passenger vehicle fleet. So this is just another presentation of, here's a bit of a pie graph, the breakdown. It tells us very much the same story with freight and with our passenger demand. So what do we see as areas of priority? Well, we completely agree with the minister. Getting electricity into transport is essential, especially the light passenger vehicles, whether that be electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid vehicles, considering that a lot of our transport is just in a very small radius. I think there's a study down in Canterbury that sort of said about 80% of our transport is within about 30 kilometres. That's sort of the ratio to give you an idea. We need some renewable biofuels, especially for air, ships and large trucks, where perhaps electric vehicles are not so applicable because of the batteries that are needed and the weight that's associated with them. And also to remember that there's a carbon life cycle that's associated with batteries as well. Another area is just let's increase our efficient technology that we use, the efficiency of the engines. It's actually can make quite a bit of difference, a hybrid engine compared to just the regular internal combustion engine. And then the last one, of course, is trying to increase the amount of public transport that we have around New Zealand. Of course, we have a density problem in a lot of our cities. We come from Hamilton. It's a very spread out city with not that many people really per square kilometre. Okay, process heat. The first thing to remember with process heat is it's a very distributed, it's a spatial system. It's not like we can say that what works in Southland, which is fantastic to hear about Venture Southland this morning, will work necessarily in Canterbury even. For example, in Southland there's a lot of wood around, but in the Canterbury Plains there's not as much wood, and so it's a lot more difficult to replace coal with wood. We also have our partner Sign who have been generating some fantastic work around the balance of coal and wood in different sectors in different areas of the country. So that's some fantastic work that I think will play a role this afternoon. Geothermal, it's fantastic, but it's regional, and a lot of the, interestingly enough, a lot of the areas where we're using geothermal we are actually wood processing, which is low emissions anyway. So trying to get some geothermal into other sectors, dairy, is a bit of a challenge because of where the dairy factories are placed. And here is our similar curve to before, a stacked sort of composite curve of our various sectors, our various industries in New Zealand, with process heat at the bottom, how much energy they are demanding, and the emissions that are associated with it. There's sort of, I guess, two regions on this graph. The first is a fossil fuel region, and the bottom is a biomass / geothermal region where it's already low emissions. And then in between there's the electricity, which is sort of Tiwai Point essentially. So I guess, oh, where's this going? Sorry. Okay, so one of the things to remember is how the carbon price, or the ETS, is going to affect fuel cost. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily present it in this way, but we made a bit of a graph of the x-axis being what is the carbon price, and the y-axis what is the total fuel cost, and then a bit of a band for each of the fuels that, coal, gas, electricity. What you can see there is the coal is quite, hugely affected by the carbon price. It sort of can go from a top price of $11 all the way up to $18 per gigajoule. The problem is, though, even at $18 a gigajoule, a lot of biomass residues and the like still struggle to compete. And so there are other opportunities that will happen long before we have a $100 carbon cost, for example, energy efficiency. Then the other sector, of course, is electricity. There's a very wide range of what the electricity price is, depending on where you are in the country and what sort of use profile that you're going to have. So what's some of the, I guess, priority areas that we see in process heat? First of all, we've got to make gains in our industrial energy efficiency. My main focus is around dairy processing, milk powder production, and there is massive opportunities there in the order of 20 to 30% reductions with newer technologies and development of new technology as well. But of course, there has to be the expertise in the country in order to transition us from our current processes to more energy efficient processes. The second part is we see renewable electricity as being a key part of integrating it into our process heat sector, and that's simply because it's a distributed system that has access to a lot of our plants already. And this may be through, for example, heat pumps, whether that be a low temperature heat pump or perhaps a higher temperature sort of open cycle vapor compression type of heat pump. There's fantastic opportunities in the meat and the dairy industry for utilising the waste heat from chillers to upgrade that. and we saw that actually at the Eco Awards. One of the award winners did just that. Renewable biomass and geothermal, but again, it is a very regional specific, I guess spatially distributed resource that we have to figure out where we can put it and do it economically. And then lastly, perhaps you'll be surprised by this, is transitioning from coal to natural gas. Coal has about double the emissions factor of natural gas, and so it is very much a real emissions reduction if you transition away from coal just directly to natural gas as a bit of a transition. So I'm going to pass back to Marty now, and he's going to walk you through electricity.
We're going to run through because of time. So I guess two things. This is our demand historically, and there's lots of different projections around what our electricity demand will be in the future, but keep in mind that it's likely to grow, especially when you talk about electrification of transport. It's not as much as you might think, but it is still something to include. And this curve here, this is our grid emissions factor. So this is how much carbon per unit of electricity, which has been quite variable depending on our hydro lake levels, but recently we've sort of stabilised down here below about 0.15 kilotons per gigawatt hour of electricity, which is quite good by world standard. And this is a way to present our mix, our generation mix, where you've got low emissions, hydro, wind and other renewables. There is some emissions associated with geothermal. The x-axis is how much was generated with those sources, and this is the emissions coming from each one. Natural gas, you can see not a lot of generation, but a lot of emissions, and we still have a little bit of coal there. And our overall emissions factor for 2013 was 0.144 kilotons. So if you look at what may be a generation scenario in the future, say 2030, okay, if you include some demand increases, okay, you can easily change that if you wish. MED, I think one prediction I saw would max out at sort of 92% renewables, and so that means some natural gas, obviously an increase in geothermal and wind, and so there will still be an emissions there. And I guess the point here is that because of our already high renewables percentage, it actually becomes quite hard to make meaningful reductions in electricity. And I've been to many things talking about energy efficiency and things like that, and we seem to be still talking a lot about electricity. And that's a good thing, it has its place, but I guess keep in mind that, remember we're trying to get to 20 odd megatons, but we're already at about 6, and potentially we may only get down to 2 or 3. And so that limits how much we can actually do. And so any talk about, say for example, PV, that has its place, but unless you're displacing thermal generation, either existing or new, then that's not an emissions reduction necessarily. It may be a good thing to do, and there are other drivers for that, but from an emissions reduction point of view, we just have to think through how that actually affects the emissions reduction. And so obviously efficiency is important, displacing fossil fuel generation. We mentioned this, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about carbon capture and storage. I put my views up on the webinar. I think there's a long discussion that needs to occur before we race down that track. There are some other energy return and energy systems implications there that haven't been fully characterised yet. Okay, so that was just a review of our target, and so hopefully this afternoon as we discuss what the opportunities are, that we just keep in mind where those opportunities and what the priorities may be. So I'll skip this, and that's the end. So thank you.